The true story of America's deadliest inmate. Life behind bars. In the modern history of the United States federal prison system, one inmate became so dangerous that authorities permanently changed how the government handles the most violent prisoners. Not because of an escape attempt. Not because of a riot. But because of multiple confirmed killings inside prison walls, including the murder of a federal correctional officer. His name was Thomas Silverstein, widely documented by federal records and major investigative reporting as one of the most violent inmates ever held in U.S. custody. This documentary presents only verified facts drawn from court rulings, Bureau of Prisons documentation, and established journalism. Where details are disputed or unclear, that will be stated directly. If you value deeply researched, fact-based prison documentaries, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps Life Behind Bars continue producing long-form, evidence-based stories like this one. Early background and first conviction. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born in 1952. Public records show he spent parts of his youth in California and Chicago. Multiple investigative sources describe a troubled early life with juvenile offenses, though exact details of each early charge are not consistently documented across records. What is confirmed through federal court records is this. In 1971, Silverstein was convicted of armed robbery. He was sent into the federal prison system with a lengthy sentence, but not a life term. At that point, there was no official indication he would later become one of the most restrictive control inmates in American history. That transformation happened entirely inside prison. Federal prisons in the 1970s, rising violence and gang structure. During the 1970s, federal prisons faced documented problems with overcrowding, inmate violence, and growing gang organization. Academic studies and Department of Justice reviews from that era describe increasing internal power hierarchies among inmate groups. One of the most powerful prison gangs at the time was the Aryan Brotherhood, originally formed in California prisons and later expanding into the federal system. Court findings and later Bureau of Prisons reports identify Silverstein as a member by the mid-1970s. The precise timing of his full membership status is not consistently documented in public records, but multiple court proceedings confirm his affiliation during later violent incidents. Gang affiliation inside prison often influenced protection arrangements, contraband markets, and retaliatory violence, conditions repeatedly described in federal investigations from that period. Transfer to USP Marion. Silverstein was eventually transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure federal prisons operating at the time. USP Marion housed many high-risk inmates and had already developed a reputation for strict control measures. Former officials later described the environment as tense, with frequent lockdowns and close monitoring of gang activity. It was inside this facility that Silverstein became involved in the first confirmed prison homicide connected directly to him through a criminal conviction. The killing of Danny Atwell. In 1978, inmate Danny Atwell was killed inside USP Marion. Court records confirm Atwell died from stab wounds inflicted during a prison attack. Federal prosecutors argued that the killing was connected to internal prison gang enforcement and drug trade disputes. During trial proceedings, the government presented testimony that the attack had been organized within Aryan Brotherhood command structure. Silverstein was charged and later convicted for Atwell's murder. That conviction added a life sentence to his existing term. From that point forward, he was legally classified as a life prisoner with no scheduled release date. This marked the first murder conviction tied to him for a killing committed while already in federal custody. It also triggered increased monitoring and tighter restrictions from prison authorities. Special control classification begins. After the Atwell murder conviction, Bureau of Prisons records show that Silverstein's classification level was raised significantly. He was increasingly labeled a high-control inmate, meaning tighter movement restrictions, more supervision, and more frequent separation from general population housing. Transfers between facilities became more common. Privileges were reduced. Security protocols around his movements were strengthened. But even with those added controls, further violence would follow, including a killing that would permanently change federal prison policy. Murder of a federal correctional officer. On October 22, 1983, a federal correctional officer named Merle Klutz was killed inside USP Marion. This event is one of the most documented prison homicides in federal history because it directly led to permanent changes in how the Bureau of Prisons manages high-risk inmates. According to federal court findings, Silverstein and another inmate were being escorted separately from their cells to the shower area under controlled movement procedures. At that time, Inmates in high control status were moved individually while restrained. During the escort process, Officer Klutz was attacked and fatally stabbed. Court evidence established that a concealed weapon had been obtained and hidden prior to the escort. Investigators concluded the attack was planned rather than spontaneous. Trial testimony later described it as a targeted killing connected to prison gang retaliation. Silverstein was prosecuted in federal court and convicted for the murder of Officer Klutz. The conviction added another life sentence to his record. This marked the most serious and consequential killing associated with him, the murder of a federal officer while already serving life in prison. Immediate system-wide lockdown at Marion. The killing triggered an immediate and historic response. Within hours, USP Marion entered full lockdown status. According to Bureau of Prisons reports and later congressional reviews, administrators suspended normal operations and stopped standard inmate movement. That lockdown did not last days or weeks. It became permanent. USP Marion transitioned into what officials called a control unit model, long-term isolation, minimal movement, and near-total separation of high-risk inmates. Multiple Department of Justice reviews later confirmed that this operational shift at Marion became the prototype for the modern federal supermax system. Silverstein's case is repeatedly cited in official documentation as one of the primary catalysts for that transformation. The killing of inmate Robert Chappelle. Less than a year after the Klutz murder, while already under extreme restrictions, another inmate was killed. In 1984, inmate Robert Chappelle died inside USP Marion during a controlled movement procedure. Court records confirm Chappelle was stabbed while being escorted past another secured area. Investigators determined that a weapon had again been concealed and used during a brief contact window. Federal prosecutors charged Silverstein with the killing. He was later convicted in connection with Chappelle's death. Court testimony described the attack as gang-related retaliation. As with prior cases, the prosecution argued it was planned in advance. With this conviction, the number of confirmed homicide convictions tied to him for killings committed inside prison reached 3. At this stage, federal authorities formally classified him among the most dangerous inmates ever held in the U.S. system. Permanent high control status. After the officer killing and the second inmate murder conviction, Bureau of Prisons officials placed him under permanent high control measures. According to official classification records and later court filings, he was held in long-term solitary confinement. Direct contact with other inmates was eliminated. Movement required multiple officers. Showers and recreation were conducted alone. Legal and medical visits were conducted under barrier conditions. Former Bureau of Prisons administrators later testified in legal proceedings that these measures were considered necessary due to repeated lethal violence under prior restrictions. Civil rights attorneys later challenged these conditions in court, arguing they constituted extreme isolation. Court rulings acknowledged the severity of the conditions but repeatedly noted the documented security risk used to justify them. The birth of the federal supermax model. The long-term lockdown model developed at USP Marion did not remain isolated to one prison. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Bureau of Prisons began developing a purpose-built facility designed specifically for permanent high-risk isolation housing. That facility would become ADX Florence in Colorado, officially opened in 1994. ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison. ADX Florence was designed for inmates considered too dangerous for any other federal prison. Official Bureau of Prisons design documents describe features including single inmate cells, remote-controlled doors, minimal human contact, isolated recreation areas, no shared housing units. Silverstein was eventually transferred there and held under the most restrictive conditions available in the federal system. According to multiple verified reports, he would spend more than 3 decades in near-continuous solitary confinement, the longest documented duration in federal custody. Legal challenges to extreme solitary confinement. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, his confinement conditions had become the subject of multiple legal challenges. Court filings and civil rights litigation records show that attorneys argued his long-term isolation constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Lawsuits described conditions including near-total separation from other inmates, extremely limited recreation, and minimal human interaction. Federal court decisions acknowledged that the conditions were severe and highly restrictive. However, rulings repeatedly accepted the Bureau of Prisons' position that the measures were based on documented security risk tied to multiple confirmed murders inside custody. Judges reviewing the cases often emphasized a key factor: The restrictions followed repeated lethal incidents under lesser controls. Because of that documented history, courts generally allowed the high control status to continue. Some details about the exact day-to-day conditions vary across filings and time periods. Not every operational detail is publicly documented. What is consistently confirmed is that his confinement level remained among the strictest ever applied in the federal system. Psychological impact: what studies say and what is unclear. The psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement have been widely studied by academic researchers and medical experts. Peer-reviewed research across multiple prison systems has associated extended isolation with increased risk of anxiety, depression, perceptual disturbances, and cognitive decline. Congressional testimony and correctional health studies have raised similar concerns. However, specific medical records for individual inmates are generally confidential. Public court documents reference mental health evaluations conducted over the years, but the full clinical findings are not publicly released. Because of that, detailed conclusions about his personal psychological condition are not fully documented in the public record. Some reports describe periods where officials stated he remained behaviorally stable under isolation. Other legal filings from advocates argued the opposite. Where those claims conflict, the record remains disputed. What is verifiable is that his confinement became a central reference point in the national debate over long-term solitary housing. Communication restrictions and monitoring. Because of his classification level and gang affiliation history documented in court proceedings, his communications were tightly restricted and monitored. Bureau of Prisons policies allowed for screen mail review, limited phone access, recorded calls, legal correspondence controls under special procedures. Court rulings confirmed that officials argued communication limits were necessary to prevent gang coordination or retaliatory violence outside the facility. Some outgoing correspondence later became public through legal exhibits and investigative reporting. Those writings were often cited in ongoing legal debates about isolation conditions, though interpretations of their meaning varied. Not all correspondence is publicly available, and some remains sealed within court records. National policy debate. By the 2000s, his case was frequently referenced in policy discussions about supermax prisons and control unit confinement. Correctional administrators cited the murders and security incidents as justification for maintaining supermax capability within the federal system. Civil liberties organizations cited the same case when arguing that indefinite isolation creates human rights concerns and requires stricter oversight. Government hearings, academic panels, and criminal justice reform reports repeatedly referenced long-term isolation cases like his when evaluating policy reform proposals. There is broad agreement in official records on one point. His case directly influenced how the federal system structured and defended permanent high-security isolation units. Gradual changes in conditions. In later years, verified reports indicate that some confinement conditions were gradually adjusted. Court documents and investigative journalism note that limited privilege changes occurred over time, including controlled recreation access and modified communication allowances under supervision. Exact timelines differ across sources, and not every reported change is uniformly documented. What is confirmed is that he remained under high control status until the end of his incarceration. There is no public record showing a return to general population housing at any point after the officer murder conviction. Final years in federal custody. In his final decade in custody, publicly available Bureau of Prisons records and investigative reporting indicate that his status remained among the highest security classifications in the federal system. He continued to be housed under supermax level controls, involving single-cell placement, escorted movement, and monitored communication. Some later legal filings and journalist investigations reported that limited adjustments were made to his daily routine compared to earlier decades of stricter control unit confinement. These reports describe incremental privilege changes under supervision. Exact operational details are not fully public, and some aspects remain not publicly documented. There is no verified record showing he was ever returned to general population housing after the officer murder conviction. Documented behavior assessments. Court records and correctional reviews periodically evaluated his risk level and behavioral status. Some later assessments referenced in legal proceedings indicated periods of compliant behavior under strict controls. Other filings from opposing parties argued that historical risk remained too high to justify major classification reduction. Because most detailed classification reviews are internal correctional documents, full assessment reports are not publicly released. Public understanding comes mainly from summaries quoted in court decisions and major investigative journalism. Where reports conflict, the differences remain part of the public legal record without a single unified conclusion. Length of solitary confinement. Record duration. Multiple major news investigations and correctional analyses concluded that he spent more time in solitary confinement than any other federal inmate on record. Commonly cited totals exceed 30 consecutive years under isolation or near-isolation conditions. Exact day counts vary slightly between sources depending on how control unit versus supermax housing is categorized. However, there is broad agreement across credible reporting that his isolation duration was unmatched in federal custody history. This record is repeatedly referenced in academic research and policy debates concerning long-term solitary confinement. Death in custody. Federal records and multiple major news outlets confirm that he died in federal custody in 2019 at the age of 67. The reported cause of death was natural causes related to medical condition. Detailed medical records are protected and not publicly released, which is standard for inmate health files. There is no verified record of suspicious circumstances associated with his death in custody. With his death, one of the most extreme incarceration cases in U.S. federal prison history came to a close. Verified historical impact on U.S. prison policy. Across Department of Justice reviews, Bureau of Prisons historical summaries, and congressional testimony, his case is repeatedly cited as a catalyst for major control unit and supermax policy development. Documented impacts include permanent lockdown model at USP Marion, expansion of control unit housing strategy, justification framework for supermax facilities, tighter high-risk inmate movement protocols, long-term separation policies for violent prison offenders. Correctional administrators have cited the case as evidence for the necessity of supermax capability. Civil liberties advocates have cited the same case when arguing for stricter limits and oversight on extended isolation. Both positions are documented in official hearings and published policy debates. What is confirmed, and what is not? Confirmed through court verdicts and federal records. Armed robbery conviction leading to federal imprisonment. Multiple inmate murder convictions inside prison. Conviction for the murder of a federal correctional officer. Permanent high control classification. Transfer into federal supermax system. Record length solitary confinement duration. Death in federal custody from reported natural causes. Unclear or not publicly documented in full detail. Complete psychological evaluation records. Full internal classification reports. Exact daily confinement variations across decades. Some disputed claims made in advocacy filings. Where documentation is sealed or conflicting, the uncertainty remains part of the historical record. Legacy and institutional changes that followed. Federal correctional policy reviews and Bureau of Prisons historical summaries repeatedly cite this case among the major drivers behind the expansion of permanent high-security control housing. Documented institutional changes that followed in the years after the murders include expansion of long-term control units, permanent separation models for high-risk inmates, remote-operated movement systems, single inmate recreation enclosures, increased escort staffing ratios, weapon screening and search protocol upgrades. Policy papers and Department of Justice documentation show that administrators used prior lethal in-custody incidents, including these, to justify higher control infrastructure nationwide. By the mid-1990s, the supermax model had become a permanent part of the federal prison system. How criminologists and researchers evaluate the case. Academic publications and criminology research reference the case when studying three specific areas: prison gang power structures, in-custody violence escalation, effects of extreme isolation housing. Researchers generally agree on several verified conclusions drawn from documented records. Prison violence risk can continue even after maximum classification increases if movement procedures allow contact windows. Gang enforcement structures inside prisons played a measurable role in targeted inmate killings during the 1970s, 1980s period. Control unit and supermax models were developed as administrative responses to repeated lethal incidents, not as experimental designs. Where researchers differ is on long-term outcomes. Some studies argue supermax confinement reduces institutional violence overall. Others conclude the psychological and ethical costs are too high. Both positions appear in peer-reviewed literature and government hearings. Ongoing debate over long-term solitary confinement. Human rights organizations, medical experts, and correctional administrators continue to debate long-term solitary confinement policy. Documented positions include: correctional security officials argue that supermax confinement is necessary for a very small number of inmates with verified lethal institutional behavior histories. Medical and human rights groups argue that extended isolation can cause serious psychological harm and should be time-limited. Legislative reform proposals in multiple jurisdictions have attempted to place duration caps or oversight requirements on solitary housing. Some state systems have implemented reforms. Federal policy adjustments have occurred in limited forms, but supermax confinement remains in use. This case remains one of the most frequently referenced examples on both sides of that debate. Historical record summary. Based on court verdicts, Bureau of Prisons documentation, and major investigative reporting, the verified historical record shows: entry into federal prison for armed robbery. Confirmed prison gang affiliation documented in court. Multiple murder convictions for killings committed while incarcerated. Conviction for the killing of a federal correctional officer. Permanent high control classification. Decades held under isolation conditions. Widely reported record duration of solitary confinement in federal custody. Death in prison from reported natural causes. Disputed or not fully public. Full psychological records. Complete internal risk assessment files. Some operational details of daily confinement conditions. Certain claims made in advocacy litigation filings. Where records are sealed or inconsistent, uncertainty remains acknowledged. Closing context. This case is not only the story of an inmate. It is also the story of how a prison system changed in response to lethal violence inside its own walls. Modern federal supermax confinement policy, its structure, justification, and controversy, cannot be fully understood without it. The documented facts remain part of official correctional history, legal precedent, and ongoing criminal justice reform debates. If you made it to the end, thank you for spending this time with us and engaging with verified, fact-based crime and prison history. If you value accurate, long-form documentaries built from court records, official reports, and credible investigations, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps us continue producing deeper, more detailed stories. More fully documented prison cases and criminal investigations are coming soon. Thanks for watching Life Behind Bars.